Welcome to the Advantage Podcast, a monthly unscripted conversation with host David Ashcraft and top leaders impacting our world. Created by pastors for pastors to strengthen our leadership and expand our knowledge and influence.
Well, hey guys, I'm here with Henry Cloud, Dr. Henry Cloud. And Henry, it's great to have you with us. What you're talking to or who you're talking to are just pastors of a group we call the Advantage. And it's pastors of the 65 or so largest churches in Pennsylvania. And we get together to several times a year just to talk about how can we see more people come to know Jesus in Pennsylvania. And so it's real fun to have you join us. And
I thought everybody in Pennsylvania was all in already.
It's close. It's close. So, it's amazing, Henry. Our numbers, I think we have 13 million people in Pennsylvania, right around there. And the numbers show that well over 8 million are totally unchurched. And so there's a pretty big market for...
Well, I think I told you this the first time we met. I don't know what it is, but over all these decades, people from Pennsylvania are good people. There's something in the water. I don't know what it is, or the gene pool or something. But I married one who comes from...
Oh, did you really? Now, where was your wife from?
They are, she grew up in Southern California, but her whole family line is from Allentown.
Ah, okay.
Bethlehem.
Sure.
That's right there in Pennsylvania, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well,
and you do have almost my favorite golf course in the world at Oakmont. So I've got a lot of affection.
Well, good. Well, I'm glad there's some things that you like about Pennsylvania. That's good for us. So, and are you still playing a lot of golf? I know you and I had talked, and you'd had your knees redone, and you were having some back issues. And so, are you able to play now?
Well, it depends on how you define play. It's not the way I define it, but I am back out there after about a 4-year hiatus of not being able to stand up. But I'm back out there. About every third shot.
Are you enjoying it?
No, but about every third shot I do.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I gave up golf years ago because I ended up being more angry than I did finding enjoyment with it. So,
well, yeah, I should tell you what I told my wife when she first started. She's so competitive and she's a great athlete. And so I kind of got her into the game when we were first together. And so she's getting, starting to get around and she can hit it, but she would get so mad. And finally, one day I said, Tor, you're not good enough to get that mad. So just change your expectation until you get good enough to get mad. So enjoy it.
That's good. Well, actually, Ruth, my wife, has told me that many times. So, but I still haven't yet taken that advice. But maybe now I'll listen to you. So
I think that applies to the pastorate. They get in there and have all these dreams and visions. They forget how hard this game is.
Yeah, exactly.
Kind of chill out. God's got a lot of problems with people too. So,
Exactly. Well, guys, let me tell you why I asked Henry to be with us. One, I just appreciate who he is. He's a author. How many books have you actually written now? Has it quite a few?
They tell me it's in the mid 40s.
Is it really? Good for you. That's amazing. Hey, a quick story real quick. We sat down in church on Saturday evening, and somebody came up behind me right before the gathering started. And it was a woman who said that her brother was at a point of committing suicide, that he was actually sitting in a chair with a gun in his hands. And he happened to reach out to her. And she said, you need to come to church with me. This was probably 4 or 5 years ago, she said. And you need to come to church with me. And so he did. And she said, just at least come to church. And he wasn't a church person. We happened to be doing at LCBC at that time a series on your boundaries book. And so anyway, because of what he was learning through boundaries, he felt like it was applicable to him. He kept coming back. And ultimately, his life has been straightened out and he's doing well and he's following Christ. But she just wanted me to know it was the Boundaries book that did that. And so I was excited that I was going to be talking to you today to tell you that story because it's been real impactful. So,
well, thank you. I mean, sit in a room and write a book and never know what it's going to do. But what actually happens, I've learned over the years, God has a body, and one person's job might be dependent, but you said, was it your sister? Is that what you said?
No, it was a lady, and it was her brother that was about to take
Her,
his
so
life. So yeah, I
okay,
didn't know the
but
woman, but
his
yeah,
friend, but
yeah,
she's the one, and it's the people that, take materials, have gatherings, have small groups, and
yeah,
invite people in. That's the only way books
yeah.
can ever help anybody,
Yeah,
is
exactly. Exactly. Well, you've written a number that we've done series on from LCBC, and appreciate your writings very much. Also, psychologist and a business leader. That's a piece that I don't know that people always think of you as a business leader, but you were running quite an operation when you had the hospitals and things like that.
yeah, it's kind of I mean, I can bore you with the 1 minute story arc here to explain that, because
Yeah, I think that'd be
kind of depends
interesting for
on
guys to hear.
well, it depends on what world I think people come from
Yeah.
as to how they might have, interacted with my work. But um, David, I first went into this field. I had gone to college, to play golf. That was my dream, and I had an injury, had to quit, got depressed, came to faith in a deeper way, and fell in love with theology. That was literally my first love in this whole adult space. And I thought I was going to be a pastor at
Hmm.
that point.
Is that
And
right?
yeah, and God very specifically told me to go into the field of psychology. I was a accounting and finance major and
Hmm.
had to change my major halfway through. And so I get through, I'm in graduate school, I get a master's, I'm still working on my doctorate, but you can actually practice with a master's degree. And so I went knocking on doors to find a job, and I got hired by a leadership consulting firm as my first job as a psychologist, because they found out, news alert, leaders have issues. So
Surprise.
um,
Yeah.
in that context, I fell in love with leadership, ended up doing my doctoral dissertation in leadership, personality. And since day one, I've had kind of two parallel careers focus, one in the clinical world and people functioning, and the other in leadership. And as I was working in all that and doing a lot of consulting for literally from day one when I started, um, what I discovered was, you know, clinical stuff deals with how people are put together. Business leadership deals with how people lead people to get business done. And I just found out that is a fake wall in between the two.
Hmm.
And my niche kind of became what I call the middle space. And it's where leadership and people functioning, performance and interpersonal and all that kind of stuff kind of come together. And then I started a hospital company, and that ended up, we had treatment centers in 40 something markets in the Western United States, and ran that company for a long time. So then I found myself on the other side of leadership, having to make a P&L work and a culture and
Yeah.
4 states and all that. So in that, I was John Townsend and I were developing a lot of materials we use in the hospitals. We started publishing that. And so I got this, sort of known in the self-help world, but I never had published anything in the business side. And then in '04, and there's a God story to this, but he said, go over here and focus in the marketplace. And so started writing business books. So really, I've kind of got two
Yeah.
publishing worlds out there. It kind of depends on where on the merry-go-round somebody steps on. Are you a psychologist or are you a business? And I go, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that's good. That's good. Well, I love what you do, and probably one of the things that I very much appreciate, Henry, about you is whenever you talk, I'm amazed at how scripture just flows out of you. And you said you were a theology major. So where'd you go to school? I know you went to SMU for your undergrad, right?
yeah, I went to SMU, and then as my father told me at the time, the world's tilted and all the nuts rolled to California. So I went to LA, and I did my doctorate at it's Biola, but Rosemead was the graduate
Rosemead.
school of psychology, as is Talbot for
Yeah.
theology.
Okay.
And so I had my theological training at Talbot, but from a background actually at Dallas
Okay.
Seminary, and
Okay.
then that's where I did my training, and then my internship is in Los Angeles Department of Mental Health, and I was an intern there for that duration, and then one day ended up another day, and then I started that company, and I was there for decades.
That's good. That's good. Well, I've probably heard you. I think the first time you and I even crossed paths would have been years ago, probably 30, 40 years ago. You were having lunch or something with Bill Donahue. I knew Bill, and that's when I think we first met. But more recently, even through the Global Leadership Network, have made connections. But one of the things I appreciate about you, Henry, is whenever you're talking, you're always basing everything off of scripture, and it just seems to flow out of you. And I don't know that, I mean, I wish that it flowed out of me as easily as it does out of you, but it seems to just come second nature to you.
Well, it's weird. There's a story there, but the easy way to explain it was my mission was to show how the Bible can make you well instead of crazy. And I really wanted to understand what the scriptures said about human functioning. And I dived headlong into that really, really hard. And what drove it further, David, was after I was in the field, there were a lot of Christian models of how you deal with emotional and relational problems. There are about 4 of them, which actually I saw as minimally effective, sometimes non-effective, sometimes even the opposite. And it's almost like reading Job's friend's sermons, or a walk through a Christian bookstore. If you're depressed, well, you need more faith. You don't know the word. Let your righteousness be your guard. Put the sin far away from you. There's got to be a demon somewhere. So, cast that out or whatever.
Yeah.
And there was a period there, a few years into it, where I kind of dropped out of life, literally. I mean, I worked, but pretty much every waking hour, I said, I'm just going to get rid of all the paradigms, and I'm going to go read the Bible. And for a couple of years there, with clinical experience at this point, that's what I did. And David, I was amazed at not only were some of these Christian models not prescribed, they come from descriptions, but they're not prescribed as this is how you solve things.
Yeah.
But all of the processes that actually heal people and change people were right there in the Bible. And so I spent a long time just mining it. And I was amazed. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, he says, and we will never exhaust.
That's cool.
The depth of what the scriptures bring to human functioning.
Yeah, that's cool. And Henry, it's that attitude that you have that just makes me appreciate you so much as I listen to you talk. Before I forget too, very much appreciate when COVID hit, you talked about pastors not having all the answers. And I think that COVID rattled us as pastors because we thought we had the answers going up to COVID. And then we got into COVID.
To make you feel better, business leaders
Same way.
Anybody else, nobody had the answers.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's left a lot of people just kind of their heads spinning and wondering, what am I doing? But you, right about the start of COVID or not long after, you did a webinar or some kind of podcast of just talking and guiding people through situations like that. It was very helpful for me as a leader, very helpful for us as a church. And I kept going back to that. Actually, I still have it on my computer on the desktop, and just appreciated that very much. It was real helpful. Do you feel like we've come through that pretty well, or do you feel like the church? And so I'll transition here real quick before I ask you that question. You have opportunity to work with leaders in business and all types of things. But one of the things you've told me recently is just a passion for pastors and wanting to help pastors. Yeah. And so how do you feel like pastors are coming through COVID? And what are you seeing right now as you talk with pastors?
Well, it's a complex question, because I think there's different sort of axes that you have to diagnostically look at that question with. One is that they're having to deal with something that's not unique to pastors, but unique to people that lead things that affect large groups of people, and that is the paradigm of how things get done and how people are reached, and the glue that holds them together, and the factors that drive something from here to there. The paradigm and delivery system and operating system for all that just changed.
Yeah.
It just really changed.
Yeah.
And so everybody had to kind of reinvent in some way.
Yeah.
And I think that the ones that were and are using the tools of adapting well have come through that part of it, the paradigm shift, pretty well. I mean, there are a lot of churches that are thriving. So you got that piece of it. The other part of it, though, David, gets to the human functioning of it. And one of the things that COVID did, remember, what was the name of the movie with Dr. Evil? What was it?
I don't remember. I'm not sure. But,
He's going to take over the world. What was that movie? Anyway, if I were Dr. Evil, I'm going to take over the world, and you want to fire the best bullet possible, I would invent COVID.
Yeah.
Because what it did was it fired a missile at the infrastructure and the operating system of human thriving.
Yeah.
Now, here's what I mean by that. We thrive and function and perform and are healthy based on the depth of our relational connectedness. Connection with God, obviously, but connection with people. Ephesians 4 says the whole body heals itself as each part does its work, connected and joined together by the ligaments and sinews. And that's how you get a baby to turn into somebody that can talk and function, is through the attachment that they have. And that's the way you get 90-year-olds who have a heart attack and stroke to not have a second heart attack and stroke, is through the relational support they have and everybody in between. COVID destroyed that. I mean, our normal connectedness, it drove people into isolated experience.
Yeah.
So if you want to drive depression, anxiety, addictions, hopelessness, all of that, get people emotionally disconnected. The second thing is that we need structure in order to thrive. I mean, God created structure, circadian rhythms, weeks, days and the nights and weeks and months and routines and all of that. And you don't have to get OCD about this, but if we don't have structure in our lives, that's why kids act out until the teacher comes in the room and says, all right, everybody in their seat, and at 9 o'clock, we're going to do this, and 10 o'clock. People pulled up their calendars in COVID, everything was canceled, and you go to white space, and their lives became very unstructured. And that's a recipe for disaster for human functioning. Churches ran into the same thing. The third thing is that we have to have a way of metabolizing pain and stress and loss and problems and our own performance. And what COVID did was it removed the mechanisms to process stuff with people. And also it removed the norms of, how do I know I'm doing well? How do I know I did my job today? How do I know what a good result is? All of that went away, and people were lost in this mire of not good enough, and loss and stress, and no way to kind of biblically and psychologically process that. And another one is we have to have control. We're designed for self-control. We're designed for human agency, that we can move a lever and something good happens. And people's choices were taken away. I'm going to go, oh, no, you can't do that. Well, let's go meet. No, we can't have meetings anymore. Well, what about no? And people were driven into a learned helplessness, which is a formula for depression. And then also they weren't able to exercise their gifts and strengths. And in human thriving, we have to be doing something that we're good at and seeing a result from that and feeling like COVID wiped it out.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the people that are thriving have, and I have this thing I call COVID reboot. And that's where COVID passed, but it did, we're past COVID, but COVID is not past us in a lot of ways, because people got into those patterns of those factors not being present, and they kept those patterns going.
Yeah.
And so some have not come back well.
So what's fascinating with what you said, Henry, is so much of that is applicable to pastors and church. I mean, your very first point on togetherness, I think, is the word you used. And I would love for you to just talk a little bit more about, you said, it's a sure recipe for, what do you say, depression, isolation is for depression and addiction and all those things, which...
And performance.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more about that, because at church right now, we're going through an effort of trying to get people into groups and things like that. But I mean, that may be a key selling point is look at isolation and the things that it causes, maybe. But
it is. And another thing about that, David, is what a lot of times, and I don't mean to pick on pastors, it's just that they're the ones kind of have to bear the burden of getting people to do this well. It's not just pastors, it's people, but and we confuse gathering or being with people. We equate that to the kind of connection that's actually needed that produces thriving. And so if you're going to a small group, there's nothing wrong with a small group that is there to learn something. We study the Bible and we go through this, or we go through a book. Great, we need that. But what we really need in order to thrive, in addition to that, is we need what I call transformational moments. And a transformational moment is when I exist in a certain state at any moment. Okay. So let's say I'm feeling lonely, or I'm feeling a little fearful, or I'm feeling a little confused, or I'm feeling like I don't know the next step, or whatever. That's the state I'm in at this moment. Well, we are designed to have those moments transformed by an incarnational experience. And I go into this group and I'm feeling a little lonely. Something's got to happen there where I walk out of that group in a different state. All right. So I've gone from disconnected to feeling like somebody's with me in this. I've gone from confused to having a little clarity. I've gone from fearful to what the scriptures called having courage put into me. I'm encouraged. So I go in one state, I come out another. Similar to when an infant is screaming and crying and they get picked up and they get comforted and have a little milk burp, they're in a different state.
Yeah.
So those transformational moments only can come from people getting into need states, which requires vulnerability. So we can have groups, but if I hadn't taken the fig leaf off and my need for what I need from outside of myself has not been expressed and met, I kind of wasted my time in this sense. So, I love, it's a profound verse in Proverbs where it says, a longing fulfilled becomes a tree of life, but hope deferred makes the heart sick. So you start to dissect that. We have these longings that we walk around with. It's part of like you get hungry. Well, I've got longing to have those need states change. If I go into some experience, either one-on-one, somebody's discipling me, or a friend, or a group, or a therapist, or whatever, I walk in there, and if I can get into that longing and I have that met and fulfilled, it doesn't just make me better. What the scripture says is it becomes a tree of life. So I've internalized that experience that now lives in me. So not only do I feel better when I walk out the door, I've got a tree inside of me of that support and connection and clarity that's going to be sprouting fruit until I need another dose.
Yeah.
But if I've got that longing and that's deferred, my heart gets sick. It's an incredible verse on really biblical anthropology, as well as a host of other things that happens inside of a human through the created order.
Yeah.
And so that's why when we're talking about these groups and every other kind of coaching or support or whatever, are people expressing their needs and are those getting met? That is glue. And it's like when you take in food, what do? You metabolize it, you get rid of the waste, but you internalize the nutrients that build new cells and strength and all this kind of stuff. So I would want pastors to be thinking about, first of all, themselves. Where are your need states being transformed? And secondly, in what you're creating in people's experiences are transformational moments happening. And in the evangelical world, we tend to overemphasize the cognitive part of that you got to memorize a verse or learn a verse. But what the scriptures say is, well, you got to be doers of the verses as hearers.
Yeah.
And these are processes that have to happen.
So what I love about what you're saying, Henry, is so often in groups, either it's content driven, as you stated, or I think we swung to the side even of saying it needs to be relationships. And so sometimes it's easy for me to think, oh, well, they're developing relationships, everything is fine. But the missing element to that are those transformational moments that you're talking about. And it would be a whole lot more compelling for me to be a part of a group if I understood that I need that for those transformational moments. Because it's easy for me to say, I don't need any more relationships. My relationship card is full. And so
no doubt,
the reason to go. Yeah.
No doubt. But it's like, I got 50 gas stations in my life. But first of all, I never really take the lid off the tank. And secondly, the pumps are empty or they're spraying water at me. And what we've got to start to, to ask is what's actually happening in those relational times.
Yeah.
And you said something really important. A lot of times they swing the other way to just relational. Well, I had relationships in my fraternity house.
Yeah.
I just wrote a book called Why I Believe, which started with my suffering when I hit bottom in college. I had a lot of relationships and friendships and great people, but I had to learn that there's got to be a segment of our lives that's different kind of relating. And that gets really important. So what you're talking about is a lot of times they've gone relational, but the scriptures guide us into the kinds of processes that should be happening in those relationships. And they're very clear about this. But you ask people, okay, let's look at your relational life, your small group or your discipleships or your accountability groups or whatever that is. Is weeping with those who weep happening? Are you confessing your areas where you missed the mark? James 5:16 says. Not so you can be forgiven. That's not what the passage says. It says so you can be healed. 1 Thessalonians 5. Are you healing and helping the broken heart? Are you strengthening the weak? Are you admonishing the places where somebody's, crossing the line and being patient with all? So that's a process.
Yeah.
So the Bible is very clear about what's got to happen in those relationships.
Yeah.
As shepherds, we have to steward the process. So that's why just getting together isn't enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient. We've also got to bring the truth that orders those experiences. That's when people change.
Yeah. So in your head, I shouldn't even ask you because it's not a fair question, but I wrestle with the effectiveness of groups still. And I was for years a small group director at a church and things. So, I understand the importance of groups. What you're describing, is that possible? Does that happen much in church groups?
it does happen where, oh gosh, I mean, you hit a hot button here.
I don't want to blow up everybody's small group structure, but I also, sometimes you feel
No,
like you're hitting your head
no,
against the wall, and
no, I'm right with you. It, Sometimes I get a little frustrated when people say, "Well, the church isn't doing this." That's not true. There are a lot of churches who are having the kinds of settings and experiences and leaders who are shepherding those processes. The church is in many places doing a great job of that.
mm,
There are other churches that tend to load heavy on maybe non-process, non-experiential kinds of, togetherness. And they don't happen as much there. And so I don't think it's all or nothing. I think some are.
yeah,
But here's the thing, David, this is what I've seen. Jesus said something profound one time. And he said to the Pharisees, well, who were the Pharisees? They were the Biblelogues. They had all the theology and the doctrine, and their whole life was about spouting where everybody's right and everybody's wrong, and you're off here, and you should do this. And they were externally oriented. They didn't go into, in his words, the inside of the cup. But here was a profound statement that I think applies to your question. He said to the Pharisees, you lay heavy burdens on men's shoulders by teaching the traditions of men, not the oracles of God, but the traditions,
mm,
these theological traditions, these way to do church traditions, all this. He said, and here's the key. He said, you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those underneath you to enter in.
mm,
So my observation, I think this is actually 100% biblical,
mm,
is the places where it's happening are coming underneath leaders who have entered in themselves.
mm, mm,
So a lot of leaders, a lot of pastors, even therapists and other people, they're shepherding people out of their own denial systems because they've never dealt with their stuff.
yeah,
And so they're just promulgating this ongoing pattern that's not allowing people to enter into the healing that needs to take place. But then you find one of those guys that hits bottom
yeah,
and the little simple answers and boxes don't work anymore. They go into the desert. God meets them there and they find this whole nother world that they never knew existed. And they tend to create the kinds of communities and teams and staff that actually do that. So I think, if you go to the 12-step tradition, for example, you got all this stuff people got to do, right? They got to
yeah,
moral inventory and deal with their stuff and make amends and ask God to cleanse them and do all this stuff for 11 steps. And then the 12th one is, now that you've entered in, go bring somebody else in. And sometimes somebody will get saved and they got gifts and abilities, and we put them in a leadership, but they're a dry drunk. I mean, they might have cleaned up, but they hadn't cleaned up inside.
yeah,
They still have
yeah.
all these patterns. And so I think
So where
that's why leaders do well to work on their own stuff first.
So where do you, I would think as leaders, my sense is that there's a fear to turn to somebody else because of trust issues. If I
Yeah.
go and expose my weaknesses fully to somebody else, whether it's a counselor or anybody, can I trust them well enough that it's not going to be exposed and kind of blow up my ministry? So where do you tell people to turn? Or is it more of a self-led process? Or how do you guide somebody to get to that point that you just described?
Well, I'm going to pick on a term here for a second. When you say self-led, a lot of times we hear the word self-help. That's the biggest oxymoron that ever existed. Self-help. Okay, if I'm the one that needs the help, you're saying I'm going to get that from myself. Well, myself is the one that needs the help. So,
Yeah.
the created order is relational. you know, and so self-guided would mean that self realizes I need help and reaches outside of that self to find somebody.
Yeah.
So we got to start there. But what you're saying is really important to pastors, because here's the problem. Certainly, all of these great things should be happening to some degree in various levels in certain contexts, or appropriate and some aren't, to work on maybe some of your pains and vulnerabilities and all that. But the problem is, a lot of times pastors are surrounded by stakeholders in their performance.
Right.
Okay, so somebody's a stakeholder. In other words, if I'm an elder, or I'm on the team, or I'm part of the staff, or I'm in the congregation and I'm close to this pastor, certainly we receive great stuff from them. But sometimes there are difficult issues that we need somebody outside of the system that's not a stakeholder in your performance. First of all, a lot of stuff, you really need the confidentiality of that.
Yeah.
But more than that, in addition to that, I should say, what you need is somebody that is there to help you, where that context is really not mutual.
Hmm.
You know, I go to an emergency room, I'm not going to help the doctor.
Yeah.
I'm there because he or she's going to help me in that context.
Yeah.
So I want pastors to have somewhere where they go outside of their system that's 100% safe and confidential. They can be 100% transparent, but also whoever they're with brings something to the party.
Yeah.
And that's important. You know, you go into an operating, if I walk out in the parking lot one night and a guy walks up to me and, you know, pulls out a knife and stabs me in the gut and rips me open and leaves me unconscious and takes all my money, you know, we call that a mugging. Well, another time I go down the street and I go in a place and they take me in a room. Guy walks in with a mask and a knife, cuts me open.
Still takes your wallet and everything in it, right? So
takes all my money, walks out. We say, "Thank you, doctor." Well, there's a little difference in the context. In the second context, first of all, that doctor has scrubbed. They're not infecting me with their stuff.
yeah.
They've worked through their own issues, so that's not getting in the way. Secondly, they read some books.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thirdly, they've done this before.
Yeah.
And fourthly, it's a germ-free environment. So please, pastors, find somebody outside of your circle that brings something to the dance that's going to help you.
So, Henry, let's get real practical on that. Where are they going to find that? So we're sitting here, a lot of our pastors in rural Pennsylvania, they're leading churches of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people. And so it's like, where can I go in my community as the pastor, the biggest church in town? Everybody knows who I am.
Yeah.
Where am I going to go in my community to find that kind of person?
It may not be in your community. I mean,
Okay.
it's possible. I mean, depending on the size of the community, there are coaches and there are, you know, therapists, and there are sometimes recovery groups. There's lots of structures, but you're right in that in your little circle, you may have to go outside of that circle. And one of the great things that COVID has done is it has made telecoaching and teletherapy ubiquitous.
Hmm.
Now, all the way from the organizational leadership coaching side of it, there are some really, really good groups that do that. Weekly appointments like you and I are doing here by Zoom, or even groups. You know, I do some of that. And there are clinicians that do the same thing. I would rather you have it in person.
Hmm.
And what I would say, and David, when I was in training, I wanted to get outside of my circle. I was in Newport Beach, and with traffic, I drove 2 hours one way twice a week.
Hmm.
And that therapist, it's kind of part of my training, but I kept that going for 15 years.
Hmm.
And that was a big investment,
Yeah.
especially in the early days. I really didn't have the money. But
Or the time. That's a big investment in time as well. Yeah.
It was, but I probably wouldn't be on this side of the dirt
Interesting.
today.
Yeah.
And the CEOs that I had an interesting discovery when I do a lot of CEO coaching. And when first years I was doing that, I always kind of thought the ones in crises and the ones that were struggling, those are the ones I'd hear the most from. They'd be calling me the most in between times we were together. And, the high performers, they're fine. I'll just see them when I see them. You know what I learned? It was the exact opposite.
Is that right?
The highest performers were the ones that utilized the help the most.
Interesting.
So this has got to become a budget item in time and maybe money and energy, that you've got some portion of your week
Yeah.
that's dedicated to your getting better, either in performance or functioning.
Yeah. Interesting that you talk about being able to do that via video. And it's almost what you said is almost what we say as pastors at church. It's always better to be in the building if possible, but it's really effective to be on video too, if that's the only choice. So
it is. And here's another thing. I think that the value of video increases if there is some sort of intermittent face-to-face that you're building on when you're on video. Like I do a lot of these kinds of podcasts. It's a very different experience sitting here talking to you, David, because we've been together face-to-face so many times.
Right.
I do some where I've never even met the person face-to-face.
Yeah.
And it's good.
Yeah.
But it's not as good.
Right. Exactly. Henry, I think those are great words for all of us, myself and everyone that's listening, and appreciate that. I will tell you, didn't go anywhere where I thought it was going to go. Where I thought we were going to go, where I wanted to go, was to talk about staffing. And, one of the things
we can go there. Can I say one more thing about what we just said?
Definitely. Yes.
I think that, and I'm not trying to be judgmental here, I'm just stating facts. My experience in the business world is that boards, and I'm not going to use the word care, but proactive expression of care, they are much more concerned and care about their CEO's development and health and well-being and invest in that than the church does, by and large. I mean, this is statistical. And they have requirements. Many times they've got to have a coach. They've got to be part of maybe a CEO small group like YPO does or others. They've got somebody dedicated to making sure they're okay. Now, some don't. Then you end up reading about them in a scandal in the Wall Street Journal. But a lot of them do. And in the church, we see that sometimes. There's one mega church that I know well, and the pastor had about a 40-year run, probably very, very successful and great, still thriving. The board of elders had a subcommittee, okay? And the subcommittee, or the committee that reported to the board of elders, the mission statement of that committee was the health, development, care, and well-being of the senior pastor. And they reported to the board, and they were funded. So what they did was organize and make sure and steward the development and health of that senior pastor over 4 decades. And on that committee, there was a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a former CEO, a former HR director of a big company, and I think, I don't know, one or two others that really understood what was needed. Now, they didn't do all the work. They just made sure the work was happening, right? And then they reported to the board of, yeah, he's on track. He's doing what we're telling him to do and all of that. But the point is, they added some structure to it and they funded it.
Yeah.
Now, most churches could probably afford in this operating budget for their pastor to have a coach or a therapist.
Yeah.
And hold them accountable to making sure they're doing it.
Yeah.
The Army does that. We do that for the special ops forces. But the church thinks the pastor's supposed to be carrying all the pain, and nobody's carrying the pastor's pain.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And that subcommittee, so even if I just understand what you're saying and go back to your initial comments, they still are stakeholders in the church itself. And so they're probably not the ones that you want to go and dump everything on, but they're there to make sure that you are going to somebody to talk to.
And they're paying for it.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're holding you accountable to
do
that. No, they're not doing the surgery or the coaching or, because that pastor probably needs to go bitch about the elders somewhere.
Yeah.
So that's got to be outside the walls.
Exactly.
I mean, not that elders and pastors ever have any conflicts.
No, never did. No, not at all.
I read that. Yeah.
Not at all. No, that's great advice and great input. And
thank you for listening to the Advantage Podcast with David Ashcraft and for participating in our goal to strengthen and encourage pastors and their churches so more people are introduced to Jesus across Pennsylvania. If you found this helpful, feel free to pass it along. To find out more about the work of The Advantage, visit our website at theadvantage.org.